So welcome everybody, my name is Kevin Gaston and I am the Editor-in-Chief of People and Nature, which is a new journal of the British Ecological Society. And one of the things we're trying to do with this journal is broaden out ecologists and their interactions with other disciplines. As you know, many of the big challenges facing humanity at the moment really are very environmental and require inputs from lots of people from lots of disciplines. And we're really trying to reach out to them. One of the things we've been doing over the last couple of days and tomorrow as well is we're exploring the multiple values of nature. And we're interested in different views on valuation and how you value nature, whether you should value nature even, whether you shouldn't. And as part of that, we wanted to do a public event, a public debate, which related to that theme. And that's what this evening is. My role really is to confirm that you are at the what is the purpose of nature documentaries, great entertainment or vital for saving the planet debate. And to hand over to Tom, who will take it from there. Tom.
Thank you very much indeed, Kevin. And just briefly to introduce myself, my name is Tom Heap. I work as a freelance, mainly for the BBC, broadcasting on probably the best known Countryfile on BBC One, Accosting the Earth on BBC Radio 4, and known to dally in the occasional panorama every now and then. And interestingly, this issue of entertainment versus uncomfortable truths is something that actually we face in most programmes, certainly most programmes that have a sort of outdoor aspect to them. And even in Countryfile, you have Matt and Ellie or Anita skipping around amongst the butterflies, and then I come on and it's like the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, because I do the more journalistic bit and I do the more of the bad news. And there is often, let's say, a bit of creative tension within the Countryfile management team as to how much they should dwell on the bad news stuff, some of these so-called grim realities of rural Britain, and how much they should stick with the birds and the mammals. And so much so that I've been nicknamed, because I get to do the bad news, I've been nicknamed the Grim Heaper on Twitter, which I actually quite like. I'm quite buying that. I think I might get it on a beanie. But it also brings a point to on Costing the Earth I do, which is the environment documentary on Radio 4. Yes, you can be more, you can dwell more on those uncomfortable truths. But let's face it, it's not going for the same broad audience that Countryfile is on BBC One. They are different vehicles. And I think this is going to be reflected in what we'll hear today. There are different levels of conservation messaging appropriate to different outlets. I would even argue that it's quite different between, the famous blue chip series on the BBC versus Netflix entry into this area, Our Planet. Because in a way, when you've got the whole globe as your audience, you can still afford to target those who are more interested in ecology, in the environment. So I think there's a difference in what can be done there, and that may be reflected in why Our Planet was perhaps a little bit more, I won't say only a little, but a little bit more prepared to delve into conservation stories and uncomfortable truths. On the other hand, we mustn't forget that famously, the BBC's Blue Planet 2 series set off the current, or was very much an accelerator anyway, of the current concern over plastics. Personally, some of which I think has gone too far. We've got into a bit of a world of plastophobia, but that's another, that's a bit of a beef of mine. But I mean, that was done by addressing making it an identifiable victim, as well as great pictures. You had the baby, the whale calf, and also a very concerted social media campaign. It was worked out, and it delivered. So these things can be done, they can be combined. And personally, I think we shouldn't assume that making people passionate about protection of nature is the only role, the only sort of measure by which success of these programs should be made. I think wonder, for its own sake, is an admirable emotion. I think that's great. I think learning about things other than conservation, learning about animal behaviour is admirable in and of itself. So I don't think it's fair to only judge these wildlife programs simply by a sort of conservation protection world in peril metric. Just moving on to the rubric of how this is going to work. I have 4 speakers around me. They are going to give varying lengths intros to themselves and their position, varying between short and very short on that. And you have most of their biogs up here behind you, so I don't really need to introduce them. They're all experts and leaders in their field. When it comes to your duties, I'm very keen that this should be a debate in which you are involved as well. This is a small enough room that we don't have to be too formal. We can get involved, but I would like you to make yourself known to me when you want to ask a question, and try and make it a question that's more like a tweet than a rambling email, please. And if you can address it to one person rather than all 4, it just gives us, I mean, others can comment, of course, but just focus it a little bit. That does help. Otherwise, it helps us to get through more questions. And I would just say to the panel as well, if you're very keen to come in on what someone else is saying, because you either violently agree or disagree, if you can leave out the violently bit of that, but do come in and comment on what the other person said. That would be absolutely fabulous. And yeah, I think there's plenty to get our teeth into here. So I'm going to start with Mike Gunton on my far right, who, as it says, is Creative Director of the Natural History Unit. Mike.
Thanks very much for inviting me. Glad to see so many people, particularly young people. How many of you are here are filmmakers? How many people are here? Can you put your hand up if you're filmmakers? Wow. I'm also particularly pleased to see that all people from the BBC Natural History Unit, because they will most certainly be the people giving most of the hardest time. But first thing, I just wanted to start off by saying that already I disagree, because natural history films is a huge ecology of programming, and Tom's just hinted about that. And they have many other valid purposes, which I think all add into that ecology. I think we need to be careful that we don't compartmentalise the programs too much. You know, they educate, they inform, they instill curiosity, they offer experience of nature and of the life on the planet, and they also, I think, they put our own lives into perspective. So I think they have a lot of values to do that. But clearly, we're talking as much as we can about the context of the environment conservation and, I suppose, the state of the planet. And I think what I would be interested for us to be able to talk about today is, you know, because I think it's a very interesting element, is how do different forms of natural history films impact the understanding of the environment and conservation? Because there are very many types of them. There are obs docs, there are dramas, there are investigative journalism, comedy, art, music, animation, history, celebrity advocates, and I know because I have done most of those types of programs. And I know how important it is that I think that the range of those approaches is kept broad. Secondly, I mean, how can we make what we do more effective and entertaining? And I again talk about entertaining because I suspect the best way to reach the biggest possible audience, the biggest number of people, and I think critically the people who don't normally engage with this type of content, is to make them engaging and entertaining. And in terms of the challenges of making these programs effective, I think we also need to include thinking about the realities of the TV landscape. And I'm speaking as a TV producer, but I think the same issues apply whether you're a filmmaker or whatever media you work in. But that includes the commissioners and the budget and the platform and the audience's appetite, and also fashion. You know, these programs and the type of programming and the approach and the appeal come in and out of fashion. And there's all sorts of complex reasons why that is. I also think we should get more imaginative in our production techniques and storytelling approach. And also, I think there's a real opportunity to be much more multimedia. I think if you think about the ability to bring these programs and the content, not just to a mainstream natural history documentary, but to children's programs, to digital world, but even to VR experiences, all sorts of things like this, radio, of course. And then I think we also need to be careful that we avoid the trap of alienating our audience. And there are lots of reasons why that might happen. And I think also of the audience accusing us of crying wolf. And there are some examples of that recently. I think finally, how can we as a community, because I think we often slightly silo ourselves, and there's a community here of scientists and communicators and NGOs and charities and activists, how can they all help each other to do what they do better? Because we obviously can bring unique skills to that, we are all basically on the same side.
Mike, thank you very much indeed. Next I'm going to go to you, Julia, otherwise we'll have
Yes, please
the
clap.
programme
Thank you
makers.
very much.
Thank you.
Like you already.
I apologise. He set a worrying precedent.
Yes,
Do go.
Okay, so it's no exaggeration to say that I, like many people, owe my career in conservation to those, Sunday evenings snuggled up on the sofa watching The Living Planet. I grew up and became a teenager, became interested in the kind of teenage pursuits, but I was always back on the sofa in time for Life in the Freezer, Private Life of Plants, Trials of Life. I didn't miss any of them. So I start by saying that, reeling off the names of those shows to make the point that I am someone who appreciates the genre. I'm coming here, with experience and love for the genre. But over the last few years, disillusionment has set in. And the more I've learned and experienced the real destruction happening to the natural world around us, the more these films feel like a lie. And I had the real privilege of being in the field for 5 weeks with the team that were filming the Netflix Our Planet series for their Madagascar dry forests part. And these guys are amazing, and many of you will know, many of you are those kind of people, that their talent is incredible. But these guys were really excited. They felt that they were there making a film with a difference. And they wanted to get into the complicated issues around the kind of drivers of threat. They spent time in the communities talking to the elders about the burning. They got incredible footage from drones of the burning that was going on. When the film came out, I was crushed with disappointment. So yes, there were some incredible scenes, natural history filmmaking at its best, of flower bugs being preyed upon by the Bertie's mouse lemur, amazing footage. And they ended by saying, since we filmed this, those forests have gone up in flames. I was like, what? They were burning when you were there and you filmed it. And these guys, they're filmmakers. They don't need me to tell them that, a picture tells 1,000 words, 10,000 words. So what's going on here? So I think I've got 3 concerns, so we'll probably explore them in more detail later. And the first one I would call nature documentaries as porn. And my feeling is that the more we kind of see nature as this kind of, it's really easy to experience and it's behind every tree there's a jaguar, the more it cheapens the real experience of nature, which, as we all know, is kind of hard to access often. That concerns me. I'm also concerned about the risk that the kind of depiction of all this wilderness out there leads to a kind of complacency. So we might think, yeah, okay, here in Bristol there's not much wild left, but out there's just so much pristine nature and wildness and wilderness, because everywhere David Attenborough goes, it's just full of teeming life. And I do worry that contributes to the complacency that we experience. And thirdly, and from my perspective as someone who works on communities and conservation, I feel that these documentaries and their complete erasure of communities, there is no people, where are people's houses, their farms, their villages, their roads? I think that doesn't contribute to helping us understand as a society the genuine conflicts and contradictions and contrasts in conservation. So things are changing. The very last episode of 7 Worlds, Our Planet, One Planet, the European episode. Okay, it started with more of the same, yawn, muskox, wonderful, bears, lovely. But then, what's this? Suddenly we had a hamster in a Vienna churchyard or cemetery, real nature, behaving and being fascinating where people are living. And then that final scene with the lynx shot right there alongside a road, and you're realising, wow, this wild nature is living up against us. Wow, what pressures it must be under, living in this landscape that we are so dominating. And how much more honest, how much more informative, and how much more likely to inspire action is that? Thank you.
First of all, I looked at the opening statement, and what I've decided to do is just look at the blue chip or landmark documentary when covering this, because as Mike said, if we start going off into all the other genres of programme making, it would just get too complicated. So I'm staying with those types of documentaries. And to answer this question, I really want to start by going on almost a short journey through the modern evolution of natural history documentary and its audiences. The BBC Natural History Unit was, of course, created back in 1957, which actually does make it older than me, but only just. A time, of course, when Britain was picking up the pieces post-war. But even then, the objective of the NHU was to build audience awareness and, with almost a moral duty, to protect the natural world for future generations. And the producers and directors did this by filming sequences that encouraged the viewers to build an emotional attachment with the animals on camera. I guess the most iconic example of this is, of course, David Attenborough's famous piece to camera with the mountain gorillas in Life on Earth, which was, of course, heralded as the first blue chip or landmark documentary series that went truly global. That sequence, and of course so many others since, have absolutely helped to build conservation, protect animals under threat. But I guess now we do have, and this has been pointed out, dare I say it, an elephant in the room. And that elephant, of course, is the human being. Back in 1979, when Life on Earth was made, the human population on Earth was 4.3 billion. And now, in 2020, we're about to hit 7.8 billion. That's a 90% increase in the human population in just 41 years. So we can't blame those early natural history shows for not making direct calls to save the planet, because, to be honest, very few people then actually knew the planet needed to be saved. But how about the 21st century? There's no doubt about it, of course, the BBC has been cautious in changing its approach to natural history, and obviously it has often failed to mention that human elephant in the room. But you've got to remember the BBC licence fee is under pressure, and it's been under pressure for many years, and it can't risk spending huge amounts of licence payers' money on a landmark series that doesn't get ratings or doesn't sell around the world. And dare I say it, bums on seats are crucial to the survival of the genre and possibly the BBC. I was in the Natural History Unit working with lovely Mike here during the noughties, and I did see then editorial shifts that mirrored the global mass audience understanding and acknowledgement of the actual need to save the planet and not just the animals in the planet. And while I believe that you can actually nudge the audience, in a world with so much competition, we as programme makers do push them at our peril. The audience has to be ready to change. And it's only really been, of course, in the last 10 years that we've seen the focus shift from just saving wildlife to, of course, this even bigger challenge of saving the planet. And in 2011, I worked on a series called Human Planet, and that last episode was the cities episode about the relationship between humans and animals. Then in 2017, it's been mentioned, Blue Planet 2 did successfully bring the whole plastic issue onto the national and international agenda. But as we know, it wasn't until last October that the BBC did dare to transmit 7 Worlds, 1 Planet, and it was the first landmark series that David Attenborough repeatedly used that phrase, climate change. And 6 months before, Netflix did indeed give us Our Planet, which also looked at this let's tell it how it is approach. And the good news is both of those shows got ratings, very good ratings, and people stayed watching. But however, the overall message we're left with in both these shows is, of course, one of hope. And of course, as has already been picked up, critics are, of course, saying that these shows are simply not hard-hitting enough, suggesting that we actually might confuse viewers into thinking that the climate change emergency isn't really an emergency after all. It's a common cold rather than full-blown coronavirus. But as the programme makers, we have to be pragmatic. We work in a very commercial and very competitive environment. And I'm afraid hard-hitting doom and gloom environment films rarely get good ratings. They often feel, I think, self-indulgent, made by environmentalists for environmentalists. To save the planet, we need a global audience to come along for the ride with us. And to do that, we can't make the audience feel so depressed that they feel unempowered. They have to feel empowered. What's the point in making switch off rather than switch on television? Because if they switch off the TV, they will switch off to the wider debate. So if we go back to the original question, entertaining shows don't need to preclude learning, inspiration, encouragement, and ultimately action. Likewise, while these documentaries should play a role in saving our planet, it's too much to burden them with the considerable responsibility of playing a vital role. I think this is a step too far, certainly for now. At best, wildlife documentaries inspire and educate huge audiences across the world, but they're just one tool in our Saving the Planet toolbox. So right now, my answer is simple. It isn't one thing or another, it's both. We need to make hugely entertaining films that help support the need to save the planet.
Thank you very much indeed. The floor is yours.
Yes, so I'm studying human nature interaction. I'm looking at all this thing from different perspectives. And I would like to take a step back and remind us all that the same process that threaten biodiversity, such as urbanization, agricultural intensification, modern life, and modern lifestyle, is actually increasing this connection between people and nature. So we're talking about less opportunities, of course, to experience nature, but also the fact that most of us today delegate all our sensory and cognitive abilities to new technologies that are developed to make our life easier and more fun. You know that in 2016, about 18 billion internet-connected devices were in use, so actually 2 devices per person. Its numbers are going to even increase. Robert Pyle, who coined this expression, the extinction of experience, to describe this alienation from nature, argued that it's a great threat for biodiversity conservation because ignorance leads to indifference. People wouldn't like to protect what they don't really know and don't care about. Now, as conservationists, we have a lot of times this kind of romantic perception about what is nature interaction. It's always out there in the wild, climbing a tree, looking at a bird, catching an insect. So have this kind of beautiful perception. But in an era where outdoor experiences are actually really pretty rare, and the virtual world is becoming much more important, I think we have to consider novel experience of nature, such as the one mentioned before, of course, including documentaries. Now, these programs can open, as I said before here, windows for many people to visit wild landscape places, species they cannot even see. But again, the question we ask ourselves is really to what extent these kind of experiences contribute they can contribute to persuade people, change attitude, to change behavior toward nature conservation. Now, if you look at the literature, scientific literature about movies, documentaries, much of the scientific debate is about the information that's being provided in those movies. And it's kind of pessimistic or optimistic vision together. And I think this is because as conservationists, we often assume that people adopt a targeted behavior if we're just going to give them the right information. But in fact, this is not the case. Providing the information is not enough to change people's behavior, and it's actually been influenced by many interactions of values, attitudes, etc., etc. And actually, studies have shown that emotional messages can be more effective in motivating people to act than cognitive aspects. And actually, what we're talking about is people experiences. This is what we're studying in Israel in my lab. Not just facts, not just figures, but actually experiences. And in that regard, I really wonder to what extent documentaries nature documentaries are actually helping us. In our studies, we consistently show that we look at different relationship between biodiversity and well-being, between biodiversity, attitude of people. We consistently show that knowledge, the ecological knowledge, wasn't the main variable that interacted to influence attitudes, behavior, and even well-being and health in relation to biodiversity. It was actually the emotional connection to nature, emphasizing the importance of emotional connection to nature. We also showed that just simply spending more time outside, going out there spending more time in nature or outdoors is not enough. Because today, I'm walking every night with my dog, and my walk looks like that. I'm actually looking at my phone and walking with my dog. I'm not really interacting with nature. Even though I'm out there in nature, I'm not interacting anymore with nature because I'm looking at my screen. This phone just told me a few hours ago that I'm down. I'm down this week, but I'm only 3.5 hours a day looking at my phone. So just told me. So I don't know how much time I find time to work, yes, after 3.5 hours in my phone. So we're out there in green spaces. We don't really interact with nature. And this led us to think about what can we do to solve it. And we talk about today more about meaningful interaction with nature. And I think, Julia, you mentioned this meaningful interaction in nature you had in a documentary, right? When you were younger, if I understood correctly. And I really wonder to what extent nature documentary can provide this meaningful interaction to nature. What we also show in our research is that psychological distance, which is the level of cognitive separation people feel from themselves to nature, is a key in providing meaningful experience of nature. Again, I really wonder to what extent nature documentaries can actually reduce the distance or increase the distance between people and nature. And this is something I wonder about, and I'm happy to talk about later. I feel that to an extent, nature documentaries actually increase the distance between people and nature. Finally, the last thing I want to say, something we talk quite a lot about behavioral change. We want to change people. We're all about talk about doing something, changing the environment, and doing something that matters. But actually, what do you want people to do? As conservationists, I'm not really sure. Do you want people to support a given policy? Do you want people to provide resources for birds, for wildlife in gardens? You want people to save energy, or maybe do something more environmental? Or want people just take a walk in nature every day? Really take a walk, not with your phone. Just really go out there and experience nature. So what do you want to do? So I think this is something us as conservationists, we haven't answered this question yet, and this actually really limits our ability to understand what the role of nature documentary is. In fact, for me personally, again, I'm going back to this profound or meaningful experience of nature. I would like to see how nature documentaries can provide these meaningful experiments and influence people to spend more time outside and interact with nature more closely.
Thank you very much indeed. We'll get your thinking caps on and your hands ready to come up, but there is no other place to start other than by asking Julia what made you slam your pen down.
I was just disagreeing with Dale. Okay, so I think the first point was when she said that Our Planet, was the first documentary to tell it how it is, and I think she also referred to Seven Planets Are One Earth as telling it how it is, and I'd say that's just not true. Both of these documentaries were billed as being all about that and being novel and being unusual. Now, I haven't actually gone through and scored the scripts and the visuals of Seven Planet Our Earth, but we did do it with Our Planet. So, as I said, I was so looking forward to this film coming out and expecting it to be so novel. Watched it and was like, if you switch the sound off, it would just be exactly the same as Planet Earth. There was nothing really novel about it. There were a few shots that, stirred your kind of heart and shock, when you see the bisons rutting and then it zooms out and you see just how tiny the proportion of the prairies are left, and the rest is just agricultural intensification as far as the eye can see. There were a few shots like that, but the vast majority was just the same as the others. And I feel that also, perhaps, Dale, I can't remember which point I slammed my pen down, but I think the other points, I just think that perhaps you're not giving either audiences or filmmakers enough credit. I mean, it doesn't have to be doom and gloom and depressing, dull, sort of lectury, preachy, and this idea that, it's kind of self-referential, has to be made by sort of academics or environmentalists. No, keep them away, give it to the filmmakers, but give them freedom, editorial freedom to tell a more interesting story. I mean, if you look at the little 10-minute film that accompanied the Our Planet series that was just online, the How to Save Our Planet, I mean, that was just incredible filmmaking. It stirred the soul and the heart, but it made you go, wow, our world is so converted. You're seeing this, but I think that film should have been more interspersed with the incredible wildlife scenes, interspersed with that kind of, look, human ingenuity, we're out there, we're solving problems, why can't we solve this problem? That kind of storytelling, which you guys, you filmmakers, can do so well. So it doesn't have to be doom and gloom. It can be imaginative, artistic, and uplifting.
A couple of points. What do you mean by scoring the script?
Yes, so what we did was we just looked at all the scripts from the last 4 big blue chip kind of BBC David Attenborough documentaries. So it was Blue Planet 2, Planet Earth 2, Dynasties, and we went through and we took the scripts of all of those documentaries, and we scored we highlighted any sentences that we had 2 different scorings, one for they mentioned conservation threats and pressures, and one that mentioned sort of conservation solutions and messages of hope. And we did that for all those documentaries to look at the relative proportion of each episode that talks about those issues. And what was interesting was Our Planet was pretty similar overall to Blue Planet 2, but Blue Planet 2, it was all in that last episode. That last episode was entirely that. Whereas Our Planet, those messages were spread throughout every episode, but the visuals, really not that different.
I do remember what made you slam your pen down. It was the suggestion that if you made documentaries that were hard-hitting on the environment, it's in some ways self-indulgent from filmmakers. That's quite a big claim to say they're just sort of doing it to
Yes, because
please themselves.
I believe you me, I've been on a lot of panels at festivals, and I've seen a lot of films that are made for environmentalists. And it's like, what is the point in making a film for a bunch of people who already know these issues? Make a film for a global audience, because I really do genuinely believe to make a difference, it's no good having a bunch of academics who know you've got to make a difference, or a few students who maybe forget by the time they're 22. You've got to have a global audience that understand this. And it's got to come from everyone, because we all know that we live in a world where, unfortunately, even key governments, and let's look at America, are refusing to sit there and accept that we have a crisis on our hands. And unfortunately, unless it is a mass movement, I really don't think we're going to push governments to do anything.
So is it your supposition that these programmes with a broad reach do move people a little bit?
Yeah, of course they do.
They do. They do move people a little bit in the right direction.
Yeah, and I absolutely believe, and when I did Human Planet, which was, I think, a really important piece, because it was the first time we looked at humans and their relationship with nature, I always sit there and I talk to people and I go, if I made 20 people out there go and do that subject, look at anthropology, look at the human condition, look at the planet, read these magazines, then we've done a job. But I suspect with shows like that, it's not 20, we're probably talking hundreds of thousands of people we move. And if all you're doing is making, and millions of people love wildlife, love the natural world, then that's a fantastic achievement.
I wanted to come in because you suggested it could actually reduce meaningful interaction, increase the distance.
So I just want to answer there. How do we really know that? Because I think at the moment we don't really know, and we don't really know what is in this kind of documentary.
Well, we know people watch the programs.
Yeah,
so why would you carry on watching the programs?
Yeah, but
what
what in these programs actually make this? People watch it, they enjoy it, yes, because it's really great and it's nice and it's pretty. Whether this is having a meaningful experience, something they take and go on with it for the rest of their life or for the next month, whether that actually changed the way they want to act. And I want to ask you this, but at the same time, I ask Julia, do you really think that providing more information and more stuff will actually change this, or be more realistic, objective will change this? Because I personally think I want to go for a meaningful, something which stays in the heart after that.
I mean, we know, those of us who study, behavioural sciences and how, the relationships, for example, between knowledge and behaviour, we all know that, there's not a simple link between providing information to people and changing behaviour. Absolutely not. And emotion and emotional connection is absolutely critical to any actual changes. So I'm absolutely not talking about we need more sort of preachy documentaries made by environmentalists. Certainly not academics. Keep them far away. But as I, repeat the point, I think filmmakers can tell those stories in a way that moves the heart, stirs the soul, makes people feel inspired, but really is more honest about just how big the changes are to our planet.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to come in on that. I've got a particular question for you.
I don't know really where to start, frankly. I mean,
Start with what's most where you are.
I'm not a behavioural scientist, so I can't, but I am a filmmaker, and I've been doing this for 37 years. And I have seen, I don't know what you're watching, but you're obviously not watching many films, because, for example, Jackson Hole Film Festival last year was the biggest wildlife film festival in the country. 1,000 entries to that festival. I would say about 50% of those films were environmental films. So to say that there aren't any being made, I think is a bit of a strange thing. Also, I think I'm not sure what the obsession is with the so-called atoma films. They are one form. They are a form, and they do something I think very powerful, which is that they speak to people in the way you've just described at the end there about what connecting with nature, experiencing nature, and they move you in a way. But I don't think their but I don't think their job is to do everything that you're describing, because the portfolio projects, the portfolio programs, that's the job of the wildlife filmmaking community. For example, tonight on The Natural World, it's going out on BBC Two, there is a program about tiger trafficking. It's an undercover documentary. It's going to be incredibly hard-hitting about what goes on in tiger trafficking. 2 weeks ago, or 3 weeks ago, there was one about pangolins, about the pangolin trade. The charity who dealt with that crashed their server. So people were so engaged with that. So I think let's not get upset. And also, I must say, I'm not sure about the methodology of working out whether a series has an impact on the world by counting the number of times they mention conservation in a script.
It's a measure of bravery, isn't it? It's a measure of willingness to talk about these uncomfortable truths.
No, but surely it's about impact. It's about the power. You can say the word 95 times. You can say the word Netflix in the paper 95 times. But actually, it's about how powerful what you say is. So, I thought you were a little bit dismissive about Blue Planet earlier, because you can't deny that the Blue Planet has had, I absolutely do agree with you about plastic being over, I think it's a nasty, pernicious thing, but we've got a bit over-obsessed with plastic. Nevertheless, in terms of actually impact, to deny that a program like that has had that impact is clearly fallacious. And also, it wasn't just about plastic. When people started to get coming to that series because of the plastic, people talked about that. They also found out about coral bleaching. They found out about overfishing. So this whole thing, and that's I think what they're saying, that these so-called blue chips are multipliers of all the other projects we do.
But surely, Mike, the reason for concentrating a little bit on the blue chips is precisely because because they are talking to the unconverted, for want of another phrase. So that's why people are sort of saying, well, this is the chance to move people.
But why do you think they speak to those people?
Yeah.
The reason they speak to those people is because the journey they take when they watch those programs is one that is entertaining. It is also educational and informative, and within it you deliver some of these other messages. And I think some of the reactions that my colleague at the end was talking about, this slightly more nebulous but empathetic experience of understanding and connecting with nature. And that is a really powerful way, I think, of getting people to care. Because you said at the end there, what do conservationists actually want to do? And I think that's an incredibly important question to ask. Tell us, and then let us filmmakers help you. Rather than just say, well, every time you do anything about about the environment, or we don't like it, or you don't do enough, and you only. I mean, the last thing I was just going to say, the thing about those, I haven't seen many of them, but I think just saying the word conservation, just saying the word about threat, and juxtaposing that with images that seem to be completely against it. You talk about polar bears, about demise of polar bears, and there's a beautiful shot of a polar bear backlit. I'm completely confused. I have
But that's
no
the
idea.
point,
What am I
that you want to
supposed
show them in peril.
Exactly.
If you're going to
So
talk about peril.
But you have to show them in peril then.
Yeah.
Why? But in the portfolio programming, that's my point.
But can I just come back very quickly? I agree
Get your hands up.
100% with you about the broader portfolio. I thought we were talking about the blue chips, so that's where my disagreement.
Well, no, we're not.
But-
We're talking about
Okay.
nature
Yeah.
documentaries,
Yeah,
and that is a huge ecology, as I said in my opening
And
comments.
I think that is a very fair comment, especially for the BBC that has a big ecosystem of programmes.
Can I come back on the second point?
Very
Because
briefly, 'cause I
I
know they're field.
absolutely never said that I don't think that Blue Planet has an impact. I think it had a humongous
No,
impact.
it's actually- it was
because
It's
it was so
pointing at me.
brave. It's because it was so brave. I think Blue Planet was unique. The last episode.
Anyway, it's heresy to be rude about Blue Planet, so I'd like that expunged. I'd like that expunged from the record. Yes, lady here.
Hi, I'm a academic, I'm a lecturer in social marketing and behaviour change at the University of Bristol, and some of my students are here, and we've been discussing the role of emotion, really, in behaviour change. And I think the most important question for me is, what behaviour do you want changed? And I found it very interesting. We had James Honeyborn speaking to our students today, and he pointed out that the social media part of Blue Planet 2 wasn't funded by the BBC, it was funded by a philanthropist. And for me, that's a really important question, which is, filmmakers do what filmmakers do incredibly well, and there's debates to be had about the role of emotion and fear and guilt and pride and all the different emotions that need to be triggered. But actually, in order to achieve behaviour change, don't you need social marketers, don't you need behaviour change experts involved, which requires funding and extra resources? So I guess it's for Mike.
Yeah, for Mike. Next time round.
Yeah, I'll just.
But do we fund social media now?
Yeah. So I mean, that's funny enough. I've spoken at the the international basically the world's top advertisers, and my spiel to them was: you spend your time telling people to stop buying a BMW, buying a Volkswagen. You can get people to change their habits. Why can't you help us get people to change their habits in the environment? And they're very interested in that. We need that kind of expertise. But the social media campaigns around these projects are, they are incredibly difficult things to pull off. You can imagine the manpower that's involved and how you pay for them. Because we're actually, at the moment, I'm trying to get a big social media campaign around the Green Planet, which is about the natural history of the plant world, effectively. Because I think that's going to be the next zeitgeist about people. We're going to all go back to hunting trees, I hope. And the BBC is not set up to do that. It's not a license fee fundable project, so you have to find other ways of doing it.
So just to be clear to the audience, you're saying the license fee will not permit you to fund the social media element?
Well, it's not as, of course, it's never as black and white as that. But that scale of operation, the license fee is for people to. Yes, but it also has to be available to everybody. Yeah. There are lots of criteria that have to be satisfied.
And when you said it was difficult, sorry, I just want do you mean because sometimes social media is a bit like capturing lightning in a bottle? You never quite know what's going to catch fire.
It's just the amount of Blue Planet, our Blue Planet, I think there's 780 assets, so 780 pieces of content. Just gathering that content is incredibly time-consuming because you want it to be diverse and. But the interesting thing was, I'm trying to fund philanthropic support for this our Blue Planet, and the philanthropists I'm speaking to are all saying we want to work with you because we know that Green Planet will get, because it's a planety type thing, will appeal to people in enormous numbers, so people will come and watch it, therefore we can get our messages out to a huge audience, which we never get. And they say we fund lots of quite niche documentaries, and they're fantastic, they win lots of awards. And so that's the challenge.
And in Green Planet, are you sneaking in some calls to action?
Yes,
calls to behaviour?
I'm not supposed to have told you this. Is all top secret. Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's the whole point of it. It's about make Britain green again. It's about, and the lovely thing about, I'm telling you all my secrets now, but the lovely thing about Green Planet and the Our Green Planet issue is that a lot of what we say is stop, don't. Yeah. Whereas what Green Planet's saying is do, plant, conserve, which I think is good. Yeah. Can I just make one last quick comment about the license fee? Dale, I never like to disagree with you, but you're absolutely wrong. The whole point of the license fee is so that we do make films that are actually for very niche audiences. We don't have to always. That's why you should all keep paying the license fee. Because if you don't, you're a commercial organisation, and then you are entirely subject to the power of the market. So you can't make things that are a bit more uncomfortable. Whereas the BBC, because of the license fee, thank God you all pay, I'm sure you do, that allows us to say we don't need to make this commercially successful, we can do this because it needs to be done.
I was only talking about blue chip. They have to be
That's my little BBC license fee.
That's the bit I was talking about.
I'd like to address the question here. So we have quite a lot of knowledge about pro-environmental behaviors, the rate of turning off your light, etc. And as I said before, we don't really know what's a pro-conservation behavior. We can start asking people, we can come with a bunch of ideas, and I really wonder what are those impacts. I think people are working now, as far as I know, about identifying these behaviors and what really contribute to conservation. We are doing this also in my lab. But until we know that, I want to say to all you filmmakers out there, for me, the first pro-conservation we have is to go out there to nature. Go outside. We are facing a huge problem. People don't get outside anymore. And this is the main concern I have. And if something in those films that you're making in the future will make somebody look at it and go outside and touch a tree, touch an insect, try interacting with nature more, I think that's a huge contribution, seeing what's going on around the world.
Yeah, we do always say with Countryfile, the danger is it stops people having to go out for a nice walk because they can actually just sit in the sofa and do it during the set.
After, so they can go out after the winter.
Well, yeah, as long as they do, yes.
Just pick you up on that. More people now live in towns than live in the country. Many people have no access to nature at all. They never see nature at all, except for the odd spider and maybe a manky cat peeing on the back of the multi-storey car park. What is your advice for people like that? For people like that, natural history programs, you can call them escapism, but they are maybe a kind of lifeline. What do you do? What's your advice to people who never see anything green?
There is nature in our towns and cities, though.
Yes, there are a lot of nature.
Who walking the dog would be heaven.
That's nature and yes, in our town city. So when I was during my PhD, I worked together with Nicola here to develop an interesting citizen science program, in which you have to actually take pictures of insects. These completely changed completely the way I looked at biodiversity. Just something very simple. You have to stand with 20 minutes with a small camera next to a plant and take all the pictures of all the insects coming to the plant. That was amazing. I got it to become really addicting. I just sit there and looking. Nature is just here. You don't have to go somewhere. It's better to go far for beautiful Madagascar, but you don't have to. You can just look at put a plant in your window and look at the insects coming to your window. You learn so much, and from papers I've read coming out from this project, you can see that those people who interacted with this species actually eventually changed their behavior, reduced pesticides, and did other stuff to protect those butterflies, those bees, those wasps that were visiting their small patch of green. And you can start, so it's not as good as what I would like it to be, but you can start with something small, even in your balcony or your window. Ideally, I would like people to push our governments to act and put more opportunities, increase biodiversity in cities, something you work on, and this will also show it's going to be very useful for our well-being, etc. Not just for nature conservation, but as a starting point. So I don't really know, and I can't tell you scientifically it works. As a starting point, you can start with looking at the plant in your window. It can be an interesting starting point.
There was a lot of talk in recent years about vitamin G, as in green, being good for one's health. And I can't remember which of the last few administrations it was suggested that a policy where everyone should have access to green space within 300 metres of their home. I'm not sure what happened to that idea over the last few elections, but it was floated at one point.
Hello, thank you ever so much. This is fascinating. People watch nature documentaries for a lot of reasons. The first episode of Blue Planet is currently playing on almost continuous loop every evening in my house because it's not frozen off the top spot. So thank you very much. We've had some assumptions about what the audience think and their motivations for watching. And I'm really curious to know what audience research you do to find out what messages get home, what messages are taken away, and what impacts the documentaries do have. So I suspect I'm probably looking at.
Well, I'll tell it to Mike.
I think you probably do that because you do the research more than.
Sorry, before I come to this end of the table,
Michael or Dale, you've said a lot of things about what you think would attract audiences, or indeed what you think would put them off in terms of viewing in the first place.
I haven't said anything about what would put them off.
Okay, well I'll ask them. But what, if any, research actually is there about what makes people watch or turn off things like this, or is that just your observed experience?
I think it's obviously a bit of both. You do research, of course, but I think one of the interesting, a lot of the academic papers associated with say how incredibly hard it is to unpick this because of the sort of the methodology required. You do kind of surveys and it's quite vague. But we do. I mean, one of the things you do is you ask literally people to write down the 10 words that you thought most yeah. And that's been very interesting actually because you often get happy as one of the words that comes through. You get sad, you get intrigued, you sometimes get energized, but they're quite consistent words. But I think one of the things is that interesting thing about a company like Netflix is that, of course, because of the way that is the platform, they have enormous amounts of data about viewer response. Which, well, of course they don't. It's a commercial organisation, but it's fascinating, I suspect, because they not only can know how many people are watching, but they can literally work out spikes and those sort of things. Now, the BBC does, and I think many other broadcasters do, these things called pulse panels, as you probably know about, where a group of people, I don't know what the numbers are, but it's statistically significant number of people, have little dials, and they dial their certain criteria into this dial as they're watching, and they write reports. And that data comes back to us, and but it's still down to interpretation. I mean, largely, from my perspective, it's just partly it's experience. I've done it for made 300 films. I know which ones work and which ones don't. But actually, I would not say that environmental films do not work. I've made a lot of environmental films which have been incredibly successful within the framework of, they tend to be on BBC Two, but they've been the high rating shows on BBC Two, for example.
I just wanted to ask Dale, none of us here can speak for Netflix because...
I have actually worked for
that's why I was coming to you. I mean, because one of the things that intrigues me is from what Julia said, what was the moment when they had all this footage from Madagascar that gave, and what in Julia's view at least, is the broader truth, that's not a word, a more whole truth. And sometime between the filming and the transmission, presumably in the edit, it got knocked off. And is that because there's basically a big figure saying, no, that's going to turn people off, that's going to turn people off? Is that brutally, is that the way it works?
Yeah, I mean, I've got to let everybody into a secret, because everybody keeps talking as if us program makers have this great freedom to make whatever show we want to make, and that is the biggest lie of all. Because when I did work for Netflix, or I now make films for the BBC, even though I worked for the BBC for years, you have a person called a commissioner, and that commissioner is the person who actually calls the shots, and they are working at Netflix, and believe you me, it is an extraordinary place to go to when you go to LA, and you go into rooms and they're just full of men and women pushing, who push numbers and around and all the rest of it, and know their audiences so well. So we have to, we are delivering for a client. It doesn't matter if it's BBC or Netflix, and that client does dictate to a large degree editorially what we are delivering. And so that is what will have happened at Netflix.
In that case, I think what you're describing, that would have never been in the main show ever. That wasn't. They filmed it, put it in the cut, they said take it out. That would never have been within the.
Well, because they're self-censoring even earlier on.
No, because the commission would have not been to include that. The commission would have been to make effectively a Planet Earth 2 for Netflix.
That definitely wasn't the feeling that people in the field had. They thought they were putting huge time into it, and they thought that was going to make it. I want to come back on the question about impact evaluation. So I think Mike's point's a really, really good one, that these things are really, really hard to tease apart. To say what is the impact of one of these big documentaries on anything, attitudes, behaviour, really, really hard. To actually do any kind of formal trial, you have to end up with indicators that are so narrow and usually so divorced from what we're really caring about. They can still be instructive. So there was a really nice study done, it's not published yet, but it was done by Matilda Dunn and Diego Verissimo, where they showed people either one of the first episodes of Blue Planet or the final episode, and it was random allocation. And then they asked them questions afterwards about attitudes, etc. But more importantly, they watched what choices they made when faced with a plate of snacks afterwards in terms of plastic consumption. And I think that study is quite nice, because it's actually looking not just at what people say, which is, people were very much changed in terms of their reporting of emotions, etc. after that final episode, not so much after the other ones, around kind of awareness of plastic issues, etc. But their actual behaviour didn't change. But of course, that's a meaningless statistic, because it's not meaningless. It's a great study, really interesting. It's very narrow an indicator. It's not really what Mike talks about when he's talking about the effectiveness of these programs. And please stop characterising as if I'm saying that they don't have an impact. I'm not. My whole career, as I started by saying this, comes entirely from watching those programs as a child. And I think many, many people in conservation are the same.
Just sorry, just before I come to Kevin, because I know what's come in, but is your contention is they don't do nothing? Is your contention that they could do more without losing an audience? Is that your belief?
This is where I'm on very shaky ground because I have not had any of the experiences that the two people on my right have. They're the experts here. But my gut feeling, just as an audience member, and obviously I'm so aware that I am on this extreme of normality, which is way over here. And
extreme normality, I agree.
Yes, I'm not normal. And nor are probably any of us in this room. We are not normal. So I'm very aware of that. But what I do think is, and this is very narrowly focused on these blue chip big productions, I do think that the talent of these filmmakers, if they just weaved in the human story, the issues just a little bit more, I personally think it could make a huge difference. But I'm not the expert on these challenges that are faced by documentaries.
Can the panel just unpick this notion of, particularly some of the blue chip programs, as being lies? Julia says there are instances here where this is a lie, this is so deceptive. I'm not hearing anything about, what point is the responsibility here? Where on this continuum can we accept the lie, if you like?
If you're going to come in, Joe, very quickly, you've mentioned one that you think is almost a lie, not turning the camera around. Do you have any others that you think is a lie?
Yes, so I think, for example, last summer the international conference for ATBC, Tropical Biology Conference, was held in Madagascar. I've worked in Madagascar for 20 years. Lots of international scientists came to Madagascar for the first time during that conference, and one after another said to me, it was so bad. I mean, I know, obviously, in theory, that Madagascar's buggered, but my God, I had no idea. And I asked them time and time again, but why? And they said, because there's lemurs and forests everywhere when you watch these documentaries. But the reality is, all of those shots in every wildlife documentary in Madagascar, I know where it's shot and literally turn the camera around to the size of the plantation as far as the eyes can see.
But that's not a lie, that's just not arguing the whole truth.
It's very, very true.
But Kevin, I'm not concerned about lying, to be honest. I'm not concerned because that's not, again...
I find that a bit distressing, isn't it?
not academic, and there have been Amos Zahavi is a great professor who talked about the handicap principle. He said that we have to separately between our science and advocacy. And in advocacy, when you advocate in this kind of field, if you are not sticking to the truth, but you're getting deliverable, you're getting something happen. For me, it's not so bad. I'm going to be trying to provoke a little bit, but I think that's. We have a great example from Israel when a wetland in north of Israel got drained in the 50s, in the middle of the 50s, and they wanted to drain everything and do not only agriculture. And then the committee came and they showed them the white-tailed eagle. It's a beautiful bird. I think when you've been to Israel, you saw this beautiful bird. And they saw that, and then they came back to this professor, Amos Zahavi, was then a master's student, asking, so how much area do you need to protect this eagle? Because they really enjoy the eagle, it's a beautiful bird. And he said, he went out, in and out, and he came back. We need something like, 5,000 hectares. And they gave him. Yeah, they gave him. And he was lying, he didn't know shit. So he didn't know nothing about how much, he didn't know any research about the eagle, nobody knew anything about this eagle, and he just picked up a number. And in this case it works. So I'm not sure we always have to stick to the facts.
A white-tailed lie. Mike, have you ever been part of a lie or something you were so uncomfortable?
How long do you want me to speak for that?
Oh my
Yeah,
God.
Well, you've got lots of examples. Bring it on.
No, but I think it's a very good point, and it's a mess. And it's a really...
What's a mess?
What you're saying about this idea that that there are these places where you go to film, and you film a sequence of a lemur. And the first film which I ever did in my career was to Madagascar, and I thought it was in trouble then. That's 32 years ago, and it's now, the places where the people have gone back many times to places I filmed, and I said, oh yeah, I know that place. They said, I described it, they said, oh, that's not there, no, that's logging concerns. And this is only in 30 years, so it is tragic. But I think the philosophy, trying to be philosophical, I think about it, is the sequences that we're trying to film, there is the pragmatic issue sometimes that if you're making a film about the habitat and you show a tiny bit of it and then give the impression that that is huge, that clearly is not only a lie but that's a deliberate lie. But I think that where this gets more messy and complicated is if you're trying to film the story of the locomotion of a particular lemur or the feeding behaviour of a particular lemur, and that's the location that you can do it in, then you film it there. And that's why people keep going back to Pyrenees. Where is it? I can't remember. Where's the
It's both Brabenti, which is the
Brabenti,
size
Brabenti,
plantation,
yes,
and
yeah.
Pyrenees, which is the one injury.
Yeah,
Same injury they always use.
Exactly,
I
and it's called David.
recognise
No, that's not quite. We didn't use the same thing. But nevertheless, I mean, there are, as I said at the beginning in what I was trying to say in my opening statement, there are realities and practicalities, issues that mean you have to do certain compromises.
Lots of
That's
hands
more
going up, so
implicit.
nice short shot. Gentleman in the pale blue t-shirt, first of all, yeah, that's you, sir. And then we might bump along. Nice and short and sharp, please.
I think my question's about marketing in some ways. When the big blue chips go out, we see coverage all over the TV, billboards, things like that. As you mentioned, like there's a bunch of more environmentally based films such as Natural Worlds, which I think would fulfill what Julia is sort of craving, but not that many people see them in comparison. Do you think that kind of through the amount of marketing that's put into certain genres, the broadcasters are kind of dictating to the public or pushing the public in certain directions when actually there are some very, very well crafted, beautiful films that aren't preachy, that don't get seen, and do broadcasters have a responsibility to even that out in some way?
Fair point. It's a very good point. The answer to that depends on which one I've made.
Yeah.
Because there's nothing more depressing than having made a beautiful film, as I'd like to think I have been involved in, and getting no marketing and not being seen by very many people. I mean, the reality, of course, is that these are marketeers. They have their skills, and they have limited resources. And in the old days, when I first started, there were maybe 30 films would be marketed over a week. Now the strategy is actually no, it's 5, and that'll be some marketing philosophy that actually by putting more effort behind something, it's more likely to break through. Now, what you hope is that that's one of your films, and these bigger pieces do tend to get it because it's slightly self-fulfilling, of course. They are very successful, ergo they get more marketing to make them more successful. I don't know what the answer is to that. I mean, we bleat about this to the marketing departments, but their response is always the same, is that we have limited resources, we have to put our marketing spend and our marketing action where we think it'll have the most impact. And the answer, I think, partly is people will find, and this is slightly what I was saying again at the beginning, that those big pieces, what you're trying to do is get people to watch those, something like Planet Earth 2 or Blue Planet 2, those get, the audiences in the UK, they get about, say, 10, 12, 13, 14, that sort of audiences. They are the highest rated shows of all. Now, a good proportion, I would say probably 60 to 70% of the people who watch those shows will never watch another wildlife film all year. They will just watch those, and that's partly because of the marketing, partly because of the legacy of them. And so I am quite supportive of it because I want as many people who don't watch natural history films to at least watch some natural history film. Whether or not there's enough, we're back to where we are.
Mike, this is a slight sidebar, but something I'm quite interested in on that. And given that, will you keep them as event scheduled moments? Because you think that water cooler, the chat and playground the next day is significant for getting those audiences?
I think that's been the breakthrough. I think I think that the shift in audience reaction on to Planet Earth was that Planet Earth 2 became an event television. It was the same type of thing as a sports event or a big drama, because on Monday morning you had to be at the water cooler saying, did you see the blood, did you see the blood? That's for a TV producer, if you're thinking about bums on the seats, that's cool.
Of course it is. Right, there's two people next to each other. The gentleman in the check shirt first, and then the lady in the back behind him. Yeah.
Thanks very much. I just want to pick up a point that I don't think you've addressed yet directly, though you just touched upon it then, which is how do we address this question in an industry that is booming?
A bit closer to you.
How do we address this question in an industry that's booming? I work in TV, I work at the NHU, sorry Mike.
It's for me actually.
Make it a tough question.
But from my experience, probably since the Netflix show around that period, it felt like, and the subsequent years afterwards, the industry it's been extraordinary how many commissions there have been across the landscape. And it's not, from my point of view, it feels like it's adding to the sort of ecology of things, that there is oversubscription in some things, that we are doubling up on many of the series that we love and know. And I just want to, for me, it's a big question of how do we navigate the future moving forward, answering this question with so much that is being duplicated. And there are stories, even I heard out in the platform today, that we're filming similar animals for the same show, for the same editorial premise, and it's also taking into account what's our role as accounting for the green footprint that we leave as well.
That's a slightly separate question. We may get a chance to come on to that, but just on that, I mean, it seems in many ways, I think it was referred to in the introduction of this, as a sort of golden age of wildlife and nature filmmaking. Do you agree with that, or do you just think we're watching more porn?
Good point. No, I think absolutely. I mean, the resurgence or the kind of massive explosion in interest in kind of mainstream society. Greta Thunberg's movement, Extinction Rebellion, all of this. It has put environmental issues on the map with just your normal man and woman on the street, and that has been reflected in interest. I mean, there's so much being made at the moment, so much going on. And I think that's super exciting.
But couldn't it just be natural? Couldn't it just be wallpaper, basically, that happens to be based on the natural world?
I think it can only be positive that there's this diversity, particularly if it's a diversity of voices. All these talented young filmmakers in the room today, sure you're making things that will have a different flavour, and I think that's super important. And the fact that's getting commissioned, amazing. It's good.
Do you think it's actually changing things, or do you think it's like you nodded slightly when I said it might be natural-based wallpaper?
No, not sure getting you.
Sorry. But what I'm saying is it actually about the message, or do these big companies realise, they've realised what the BBC realised 8-10 years ago, that this stuff is really popular and it's beautiful, and that's really what gets people in. It's a sort of a beautiful experience that's releasing serotonin in my brain.
Yeah, but unfortunately, I can't say, because I can't say what's really beautiful and attract lots of people. It doesn't have any effect. And Julia talked before about short-term effect. I'm starting sure there can be a short-term effect in attitudes and maybe in behavior. What happened about months afterwards, 2 months afterwards? Started to try to look at that. Haven't seen that is such an effect. And we are talking quite a lot about, again.
Because you can't study it. The fact that studies haven't shown it doesn't mean it's not there.
No, I completely agree, because I completely agree with that. But then again, not only not that they don't know effect, but also the question, we don't know what makes this effect. Also something which really tough to study. What in this film makes this effect? And in that regard, I think you talk quite a lot about the discourse here in England, and we've talked about going back to Israel. That's looking from another perspective. These are much less common. People would look, again, as far as my unexpertise, in talking to my group society, people look less on nature behavior. I think here in England it's quite a big thing.
Just picking up the gentleman's point on this side, Dale, I mean, obviously the increase in wildlife filmmaking is fantastic for the wage packets of wildlife filmmakers who are all in demand. Is it definitely good news for nature as well?
Well, it's quite interesting because, first of all, it's the same group of filmmakers who are making the shows for Netflix, as we know, because it is literally almost everybody who started out the Natural History Unit. So, a lot of the people who are now making Netflix
on double the money, I was told earlier today.
Look, there isn't an easy answer to this. There really isn't, and it of course there's competition in the market, and I'm afraid we live in a competitive commercial world that's based on growth, and I think this is a basic issue that we have here. Is TV is part of that market, and we have to respond to that market so we do have jobs and we do make these films, because if we stop making them, I do honestly believe the world won't be a better place.
Thank you very much. I want to get through some more. Lady in black, and then there's some folks over here I need to get to as well.
Hi, I'm very loud anyway. Can you hear me anyway?
We can hear you. Have a question.
I just want to say it's great for Green Planet, for example, that we're hearing do's. I think we're in the age of what to do. People want to know what to do. They're seeing all of that stuff happening. I think that goes back to your point, Julia, on that. Well, proactively, what are we doing to change it? I work in wildlife. I've come over from originally drama to current affairs to wildlife. And what I've noticed is it's the same people telling the same stories to the same commissions. And I think it's at commissioner level. So as you've said, Mike, it's a really good point. If you're going to get
Can you come to a question, please?
yeah, if we're going to get to people to watch a nature programme and they don't normally watch it, you've got people in your industry who do what they do very well and are very skilled. In other industries, like in the entertainment industry, you've got people who are very good and very skilled. So they draw in a whole different type of audience. So it's great to hear that you're open to talking to advertisers. I suppose my question is, how open are you to doing co-pros which bring nature and entertainment and can invite in different audiences?
Thank you very much.
Well, I think that my last note down here was about when we were talking about when I was said I have so many things to talk about this hard hitting. I think there's nothing wrong with hard hitting. I think we should do hard hitting. It's just you've got to find the right vehicle to tell that story. And yes, it might be through working with an entertainment producer or from an entertainment perspective. And I tried to list at the beginning. We've done this. I mean, I have done it with celebrities, I've done it with animation, I've done it with music. You know, there are many, many ways of doing this. Sometimes they've been successful, sometimes not. So this is why I think my challenge to the audience is perhaps don't make another Planet Earth or Blue Planet. Make something else that has the same entertainment, the same scale, the same impact, but takes a different grammar, takes a different style, takes a different approach. Because effectively, those shows, that format was invented by David Attenborough in 1975 with Life on Earth. We effectively, that format has been replicated time and time and time again. Maybe it's time for a new approach, and I would love to see that.
Well, you brought Dynasty, brought a lot of that in.
Yeah, I think. Well, I mean, it's interesting about this because Dynasties was a deliberate attempt by me to not do another film of Planet Earth, and because at the time I thought that whole format was dead, and then I was making Planet Earth 2, and look what happened. I got that wrong. But anyway, the point was that we were trying to tell stories about a different type of story about the natural world. What I didn't know, although I chose deliberately endangered animals, what I did not know was that the stories would naturally. There was no intention to introduce a human impact story in any of them, but they just naturally occurred. And this is why I think your data of how many times we mention conservation is slightly spurious, because the impact of the poisoning of those lions on that story and the impact on the audience and the direct was, I think, and the audience thought was extraordinary. Yet we probably mentioned conservation 4 times.
Okay, gentleman up there.
Yeah, this is a slightly left field question, but it's prompted by something that Asaf said about encounter and the way encounter shapes values. Okay, so if you can make a good case that the roots of environmental philosophy, environmental ethics, go back to the Romantics through John Muir, Aldo Leopold, Carson, etc. And they were quite intuitive people, so they were scientists, or some of them were scientists, but they were also very intuitive. So nature was not just to study, it was also to experience. It was enchanted, if you like. So the question really is, I might be not watched enough nature documentaries, but I get the impression that they are primarily supported and, in a sense, driven by science and scientists. What if nature documentaries took on a little bit more of that intuitive and co-opted artists and poets and people, theologians, philosophers? What would they look like if they tried to take the lessons of the founding fathers like Muir and put that into today's documentary?
Do you have an advisory panel of artists and theologians?
No, I'm not sure. Maybe we are. I mean, I must admit, I can't actually see that bringing that many viewers.
But I mean, presumably as well, you claim that a lot of the program makers are the artists in this.
Yes.
They're the ones that are bringing that eye of the classical composition or whatever it is.
I mean, it's a fascinating thesis, but I don't think we'd get huge ratings, personally.
He said it was left field. I'm going to leave it
It's
there.
great.
Gentleman in the middle at the back. Sorry, did you want to hear from someone else?
I just like to hear
Asa, sorry.
Yeah.
There you go.
So I think it goes back again. I'm concerned about. Sorry, I'm concerned about providing over information. Yeah. So I go with what you said. going with different ideas, something to talk about the emotions, going strongly to the emotion. Now, I do think, again, I'm not no experience in making film, but I do think that artists and other intervention people can contribute to making this experience beyond this kind of just providing information. I'm concerned a bit. So on one hand, Julia talked about the camera that did the movies about what happened, but the distractions was actually shut off. But on the other hand, if people can start talking in documentaries about those problems, again, we might lose a lot of audience, and I feel we're going to lose a lot about those emotional connections. And what you suggest is an interesting direction to study.
Thank you. I want to get through something there. Gentleman in the middle, back blue, yep, you sir. And then nice short question, nice short answers too, please.
That's fine. Two things. I realise the problem with commissioners. They do want programmes with a big long tail on them to make lots of money. So do we need braver commissioners to commission, more issues-led programmes? And what about a magazine show that looks specifically at environmental issues on an international scale? So that we can get that.
Somebody who Amanda, speak.
Well, exactly, like the old nature series, for example. I mean, should you be pushing those things towards the commissioners?
Right, okay. So I think if you look at Spring Watch, Autumn Watch, if you look at the watches, I think if you'll see a shift, those programmes are now effectively doing what you're describing in a magazine show, which does try to do a significant number of environmental conservation fabric within them. The first question about...
But that's all UK, Mike.
Yes, but then we did Blue Planet Live and we've done Alaska Live. So we've done those live shows, those magazine format shows. They also multi-location, lots of stories. Again, there's quite a lot of conservation and environmental fabric in that. We have actually tried to get a Spring Watch, an international Spring Watch. Actually, you can probably imagine. Fiendishly expensive, fiendishly complicated because of all the different time frames of people doing that sort of live event. We're not trying. These are not easy things to necessarily do, and people have to pay for it. Nobody will do this for fun. They want to. Commissioners want. It's their money.
Is that not the BBC's remit?
We'll leave it there. Thank you, sir. Yes, lady in the.
That is a very good point, though. Mike said the BBC is free from commercial pressures.
Well, it's not.
Kind of political pressures there, are there? Why can't BBC be braver?
Well, not so. We are free from commercial pressures in that we can take risky commissions. Yeah. That doesn't mean you can just get £1 billion and chuck it in a bin.
No.
Which what I'm trying to say is that show, to make that show, would be incredibly expensive, and therefore I think it would be. I'm not defending commissions; they get on my nerves. But I've just remembered to be recorded as well. But they have a responsibility. They have a limited amount of money. They have a responsibility to spend it wisely.
Thank you. Yes.
I was just going to ask, what about the actual environmental impact of the documentary itself? So,
good point.
If the purpose is entertainment rather than educational or behavioural change, how do you justify the offsetting of behaviours and environmental impacts?
Right, this is
2 seconds then. I think, were you getting at this? That's why I thought you were right, because I didn't get a chance to answer it. I think there's a real challenge, a real problem, that there is this of the gold rush. The gold rush means that everybody is queuing up to film the same flipping tiger, the same flipping lion, the same bit, whatever. And I think that is a real problem, because there's the lie, and that's not only a lie, but that's real welfare issues. I don't think
that's quite, that may be part of it. I thought it was about travel and things like this to these.
But yes, the travel's part of it. But my issue, I think, one of the issues is animal welfare. That these animals are turning into celebrities who are under enormous pressure from camera crews, because especially if you think about it, 6 crews go there. The first 5 crews get this close. Somebody else says, "Well, we'll get a bit closer," and then everybody's trying to do better than the last person. I think that's a
great story. I want to hear that story. But there's so few of them there that we're actually putting pressure on the individuals. And surely that backs up Julia's point that you're focusing on the one surviving whatever and making it look like there are loads of them.
Well, no, it's not necessarily because it's the last one. It's the one that you can get the camera close to.
But nevertheless, it's because there are a few of them.
No. It's just because they are just that.
Well, then it's not really wild anymore, is it?
That's what I've just been saying. I think that is more of an issue. I think this is.
And just before we let you off on it, what about the travel carbon offsetting story? Is it something you worry about? And
we do.
What do you do about it?
Well, Seven Worlds was the first. I think it was the first carbon. Was it the first carbon neutral series?
How did you achieve neutrality?
I think by offsetting. I think right. The next one that we're doing is about Frozen Planet, which is hugely about climate change, of course, because of the impact on the poles. They are trying that. It's a very difficult position for them to talk about climate change and then be
You can't use local crews in the Antarctic.
It's very tricky. And in the end, actually, the truth of it is, if you actually use a local crew and you charge your batteries but you use a helicopter an hour, you've blown your whole carbon in that 1 hour.
Lady there, and then gentleman down here.
Hi, bit of a hard question, sorry. For
like
Julia and Asaf. So, where would we, let's say we have a bit more freedom as filmmakers, just imagine that. What would you, where could we start? What, do you have a bit of advice for
we'll
us?
make this quick. Where would you start? You get your ideal documentary, you've got 20 million, let's say.
I've got no idea how much things cost. Last time the BBC called me up about they were going to Madagascar and they're going to film, and I can write blah blah blah, boring, I know what you're going to shoot. It's all the same. And I suggested a slightly different angle. Now, obviously, I have no idea if this would sell, but I thought just interweave this incredible, talented filmmaking of the kind of natural history, etc., with the human stories, the people living alongside that wildlife, the heroes that are really trying to kind of save those last lemurs, the people acting as local research guides, etc., and the villagers living alongside them in their own voices. Whenever we hear local people's voices in the media, Human Planet did it very well. There's been various documentaries that have done it well. Genuinely, it's fascinating. People love people. We love wildlife, but we love people. So interweave those human stories with the incredible wildlife nature stories.
Hang on, we're going to take this in turn. Wait a minute. Asaf, first you have your 20 million. What are you going to put in?
I don't know how much it costs again, but I completely agree with Julia. And I will start with people. So I would think about a program, and this may be like something new for you, that starts from the people, talking to people. Maybe they can start filming something close to their homes, close to their nature, in their gardens, in their balconies, and then I might send a crew to film it. But I try to start relating this nature here in England, next to your house. This is something which I hope, again, can encourage people to go out, to look for it, and later on to connect to these films, much more than connecting to something which is very distant at the end of the world of Antarctica.
Sounds cheap too, user-generated content.
So, Julia, I've got great news. In fact, I've got great news for both of you. So, we've just started making it's a blue chip series called Wonders of the Celtic Deep. The first bit of good news, it's about underwater in Wales and Ireland. Yeah, so it's right on our doorstep, and it's about getting people to engage with the incredible wildlife we have on our doorstep. And the fourth episode is called The Heroes of the Celtic Deep, because I'm a huge believer in humans. I love human beings, and it is all about exactly what you've just said.
Will you be covering in that the terrible thing that is scallop dredging, that destroys our inshore
I don't know at the moment, but possibly
surely a great
heroes.
example of what should, that we're destroying the man of our inshore waters through this, and it goes on all the time.
Yeah.
And they get away with it because it's not seen. You could make it seen.
Yeah. So we could do that in Heroes, yes, but we've just started. So there you go.
I think the wildlife programs are really fantastic. But as for children, I mean, not many of them can actually just sort of picture themselves in it. And I think Asaf's absolutely right. You need to be looking at the butterfly in your back doorstep, and everybody has the opportunity. Does the BBC produce films for schools, wildlife films?
So schools or children? Children. Well, Andy's Wild Adventures.
Ranger Yassin, one of our students, Bangor University student, now has his own CBBS documentary, Him with Kids.
Yeah, thank you. There's a huge number of them. And actually there's a lot of...
And we have BBC Learning as well, so they do it too.
No, sorry. I want to hear more from these people. I'm terribly sorry. So you take it up, talk to them a little bit.
Sorry, I'm not too quiet actually. I was just interested because I'm actually a cram fisher myself.
Okay.
And just coming up with scallop dredging, sparked an idea. Is there any like concern about pitted interests by larger commercial industries which might have something to say about what's filmed? And I was just wondering whether
You mean for the worst, vested interests that are influencing for the
so
worst
like,
or for the better?
Like for instance with scallop dredgers, we're obviously, like as a crab fisherman, as a static fisherman, I'm well aware of their environmental impact. I was just wondering if there's any concern from like a film developer's perspective of these large stakeholders
influencing.
Do you remember Price of Salmon? Do you remember the point of Jeremy Bristow about salmon? Basically, it was
salmon film.
It was about salmon film.
Yeah.
And that was that we put that film out. It took I don't know the percentage. I think it was something like 12% of the share price of the largest fishing company in the world overnight.
That's impact.
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying. With these but that was the reason why. But I think the reason why that had impact was because it was framed through human a health concern. It was about PCBs in salmon fishing, rather than, although it was full of environmental stories, it was full of animal welfare stories. It was actually that it was the hook, which I was going back to again. How do you find hooks that make these things engaging? It was through a human health issue.
There's a sad fact we're witnessing today that people care enormously about health and only a little bit about the environment. Gentleman right behind you. So this lady here, and then that's going to be it. So
cool. Quick question to Julia. I think conservationists, filmmakers, we feel like we should be getting information out there. If only people knew the truth, they would act. But is there a worry that we could breed complacency by every film talking about all the environmental impact of this or that, but actually for most people's daily lives who watch these films, their lives aren't changing? So
yeah, I think that is a really good point, and that's why it can't be the preachy doom and gloom. It's got to be these human stories interacting. Yeah, basically I agree. Yeah.
Right, Lady here with this large skull. Is that a microphone or a wolf?
Hi. So my question is, we're all sat here as researchers, academics, filmmakers, talking about what we think people want to see. Do we ever ask the public what they want to see on TV? And would that help with the behaviour change that we want to see?
I guess we do. We mentioned research. I mean,
well, it depends what you mean. I mean, do I go out and walk down the street and say, do you want to watch? No. But do research groups try and find out what the zeitgeist of the population is? Yes, all the time. You'd be a fool if you didn't do that. If you were a broadcaster, yes. So at meta level, of course.
I just wanted to put a little bit of a plug in. It relates to what you were saying about people, and I confess this is something I'm personally related to. In the sense, I do a bit of work for the Whitley Fund for Nature, whose whole existence is about the heroes of conservation. And every year they produce 7 or 8 fantastic heroes of conservation, and they give them some money, and they get mini films voiced up by David Attenborough actually about these people. And every year I think these human nature interaction stories could make fantastic nature programs. And I don't want to be rude about the Natural World or BBC ones or BBC Do, but I mean that sometimes the big broadcasters should have the guts to give them the big treatment and say this is something we really think should work. These human nature, the human heroes of conservation, couldn't that make a big series?
If you watch what we do, if you watch Shark, if you watch Cats, if you watch Primates, there's a whole episode. Each of those 3 films, there's a 3-part series. The last episode is all about conservation heroes. Planet Earth 3 coming out. The last episode is called Conservation Heroes. And there's a film. And also you were saying about not talking about animals and people. Planet Earth 2, last episode was about cities. Planet Earth 3 was about cities. I think. I suppose I find this always when tries not to get defensive about it, but you do it a little bit, that hold on guys, watch what we do, rather than just fixating on this. It's obviously not perfect, because the outcomes are not what we want, but I don't think it's through lack of trying, and I think that's what I tried to say at the beginning. We're all on the same side, we're trying to get this to work, not try to just criticise each other's pathetic attempts. We need to try and do it together.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed.